Okay, great. So what I want to do today, and this is going to be a little bit different than what we'll do in a lot of the rest of the semester. As you can see here, I've got a visual. And I want us to spend most of the hour actually looking at this map and trying to figure out what American settlement means. And I'm happy to send this map to everybody too. It's a pretty standard map of the United States. But as you see here, it really gives us a variety of terrains, which is great, not just the states, but we have all 50 there, but it's the terrains for the purposes of this class that I want us to really think about. So we have already talked about the fact, and you guys are reading this in your readings, you're gonna get this. I've already talked about the fact that there are these four great different ways of thinking, these four different folkways of people coming over from the British Isles, in addition to the peoples who are being brought against their will from Africa. So we essentially have, in America, we have the story of 6 different peoples. We've got the 4 peoples from the British Isles, those from Africa, and then of course the natives. And that's going to be a huge part of what all of American history up until the Civil War, and even after the Civil War, is really about. A mixing of these peoples, trying to figure out how they live together, how do they run into one another, how do they make things work. It's going to be one of the most important questions. How does this population work? Now, remember as we were talking about colonial America, almost all of the English who settle, there are a few exceptions, but almost all of them, 98%, 99% of them, are going to settle all along the Atlantic coast. So almost all settlement of the English is going to be right here on the Atlantic coast, and even as late. So remember, Jamestown, 1607, that's very early. And then we're going to have Plymouth Rock, 1620, so just 13 years later. And we're going to have all of those great settlements come in. We will not, in America, have any new peoples come into America after the 5 groups until the 1840s. So that means all of American population up until 1846, so basically from 1607 until 1846, all of that population is based on those 5 groups that come over. Once we get to 1846, we're going to have the Irish and the Scandinavians and the Germans start coming, and then we'll see another huge wave of migration in the 1880s. Then it's mostly Eastern Europeans and Greeks and Mediterraneans, and then we're going to see another huge one around 1900. Once again, Italians, Mediterraneans, we're going to see that, and we're going to have that kind of migration for a very long time period, very long in U.S. history. But for our purposes and the purposes of this first third of the course, we're really talking only about those 5 groups. Now, there's something really interesting about, did you have a question?
I was just wondering, like, are there any reasons in particular that, like, the migration stops for that long
Yes,
time?
yes. If I haven't answered that this class period, towards the end of class, ask me again, because this is a great question, right? So why those 5, right? Okay, and obviously one is unfree, critically important, but 4 are free. And so why those and not others? There are others. There are Dutch who settle, there are Swedes who settle, there are French. French, obviously, out in the larger areas of the United States, or what will be the United States as well. But for the English colonies, it's only those 4. And why? We think of America as a country of immigrants, but there's a huge time period where it's really not, and yet we have huge populations. So we've got to figure that out. So this is a great question. Okay, so here we have this thing, and I want you to think about this, whatever your own bias is on this. What is one of the greatest advantage Americans have being Protestant? And I don't mean, don't give me something like, well, they didn't have a pope, good for them. Right? That's not what I'm asking. What's an advantage of being Protestant that Catholics do not have at the same time? We've talked about the ability to self-govern. Right? We saw that with the Plymouth Combination. But there's something else. Protestantism is based on what, ultimately? In a positive sense. Leo?
I mean, in a way, this is kind of that they didn't have a pope. They didn't have to, they weren't bespoken, I guess, or beholden. They weren't beholden to an administration. administration,
No, but what are they beholden to?
the Bible.
The Bible, right? And what does that mean? It means they read. So American Protestants are the most literate people in the history of the world. Most Americans can read. That's astounding. Now, that doesn't happen in other places. And it's because almost everybody uses the exact same Bible. Anybody know what version? And it would be only this version they would use. King James, thank you. So they're all speaking and thinking in the King James. And what do they believe about what they're doing here? They believe that they're doing something special. Not just the Pilgrims, but the Puritans and the Anglicans and the Quakers. They all believe that they have been given this land by God to do something with it. And they take very seriously not just the fact that they are led by the Bible and that they can read and write. They also take Genesis very seriously. And they believe that the duty of a good Christian person is to farm. That's what we do. God made Adam to have stewardship over the animals. He made America in the same way. And so we're supposed to do the same thing. And that means that we are not only incredibly literate, we're farmers. We're going to talk about why that's so important for America. So I want to point out a couple of things on this map. And if you remember, as I just said, and getting to the great question about why only 4, these 4 migratory groups, along with the 5th, unfree one, all cling to the Atlantic Ocean. And if we start, let's just say we're in Jamestown in 1607, or we're at Plymouth Rock in 1620, all of us tend to think of American history as this inalterable move from Plymouth Rock to Rodeo Drive. Right? Isn't that what we want? We're just moving constantly. And so our whole orientation in American history is standing at Plymouth Rock and looking west. Right? That's how we think all of our great paintings, all of our great art, our great literature, Natty Bumppo, The Last of the Mohicans, the art of the Hudson River School, all of it is about looking west. That's what we're always doing. We're looking west at all times. But there are problems with that. Let's say, for example, that you happen to live in 1620 in Santa Fe. Really old community. What direction do you look? Probably you're looking south towards Mexico City, even though it's 1,000 miles away. Right? Probably. If, and you guys, this is an esoteric part of history that it has changed for all of us because of Rand McNally and great map companies, but let's say we live in Quebec in, 1650. What would our orientation be then? Mary Kate says south, kind of. Certainly down the St. Lawrence River, right? The river would be everything for us. So we would either look up or we would look down. But anybody know, and this is really, there's no reason any of you would know this, but if we were to pull a map out in Canada in 1650 or in Great Britain in 1650, what orientation would North America be? Anybody know? This is how we do it. We're always in America, we orient our maps north towards the magnetic pole. But Mary Kate?
Would it be back towards France?
Exactly the opposite. That's a great guess. But what happens is the orientation for Canada and Britain is always with the west at the top of the map. Kind of odd, huh? And yet that's the way they thought about it. And so anybody know, think about if this was the map and we turn it up, right, and we're looking this way, what would Michigan be on a map? What did they used to call us? Anyone know in this region?
Northwest Territory.
Yeah, that would be from the American perspective, right? Because that's Northwest. That's a great, I mean, David, you're absolutely right. What about from the Canadian? This was called Upper Canada because it's at the top of the map. Now, I'm not trying to, these are trivial things, but perspective really, really matters. And we're telling this story, obviously, from standing at Plymouth Rock, looking to the west. And so we, as Americans, think this is all ours. It was always ours. Of course, that's not true, but that's how we think about it. This is, even look at the map here. You have all 48 states and then the other two that are kind of really odd when you think about it. But we have these other two that are out there, right? And how many people in here have been to Alaska? 1, 2, yeah, right? I bet more of you have been to Hawaii. How many have been to Hawaii? Yeah, of course. It's actually not much more. All right. So, and since I'm asking you questions, I've got to ask you another one. How many of you were raised on farms? 1 person, 2? Okay, just 2? Yeah, kind of, right? Was it kind of a hobby farm?
No, we didn't have a farm, but like I was surrounded by farms.
You were surrounded by farm. How many of you were raised as farmers? None of you? Okay, that's interesting. I didn't have anyone in the last class either. That's a change. It's a big change, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so we take it for granted that this is all ours, right? And when I was growing up as a kid, and I know this has changed dramatically since 9/11, very few people thought of Canada as a separate country. It was a separate country, but the border was totally free. You just go back and forth into Canada. Now that's changed. But for a long time, Canada was just our northern neighbor. And we used to always joke, I'm sure the Canadians didn't like this, but we used to always joke that Canada was our 51st state. Yeah, I mean that, and yes, it's bigoted, but it was also, there's just kind of the way we took it for granted. So here we have now, thinking about the 48 United States and Alaska and Hawaii, imagine settlement starts as early as 1607, but by 1815, 200 years later, it's only to the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains. That's it. And this whole area on this side of the Appalachian line is called the fall line, F-A-L-L. And what that means is that the water all along here flows to the Atlantic, not towards the Ohio and the Mississippi. So the fall line is the line in which the water moves to the Atlantic. And what that means is that for the first 200 years of the English in North America, they clung like mad to the Atlantic. Why? Why would they do that? Especially when we think of Americans as farmers taking up land. Why are they so oriented towards the Atlantic? Mary Kate?
No.
Okay, Leo?
They could ship their produce.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only ship their stuff out, they can ship stuff in. Right? So everything is based on us being a colony of England and all of our goods. It means that we're not really trading with each other, and we're not really trading in the interior. And when we do trade with each other, we move goods from port to port. So we'll move goods from Boston to Charleston, maybe, but not on land. So here's, and again, trivia, but trivia that tells us something. It takes and it costs as much money. Let's just take 1 ton of goods, right? TON, 1 ton of goods. Good measurement for any kind of good, whatever it may be. It's going to be non-food stuff, so maybe it's going to be lumber or pitch, something to deal with making ships. But whatever it is, if we take 1 ton of goods, it costs the exact same amount in 1800 as it did in 1700. It costs the exact same amount to ship that ton of goods from Stockholm to New York as it does from New York 10 miles inland. So to move a ton of goods 3,500 miles on the ocean is worth 10 miles on land. Now that's really important for us because, again, we take things for granted. Yeah, I've got my Honda right out here. I could get in my Honda. I could be in South Bend in an hour and 35 minutes, depending on how good traffic is and how fast I'm going, but roughly an hour and 35 minutes. I could be in downtown Chicago in 3.5 hours. I could go to Romulus here in Michigan, get a plane, and by late this afternoon I could be in Portland. Right? We take all of this for granted. But imagine if you had roads that were roads only because they had cleared stumps down. And this used to be the definition of a road, an area that had tree stumps no larger than 18 inches high. Think about that. Can you imagine driving over a whole bunch of stumps? and as long as it's 18 inches high. And it's a problem. You have no shock absorbers. There's no such thing as refrigeration at all. Refrigeration means it's late fall or winter and you're moving stuff. That's refrigeration. It doesn't get any better than that. Or, you might make a refrigerated hay barn or a place to keep your potatoes, but nothing that can last for any amount of time. This was back when ships used to go up to the Arctic Circle and grab chunks of ice to come sell it in New York. I just chip parts of it off. Yeah, there's no way to make this stuff. And so it won't be until the railroad is developed and until the interstate system is developed that we have rapid ground transportation. It is extremely expensive to move goods. Have you ever wondered why it took Ulysses S. Grant 7 months to go from northern Tennessee into Mississippi? There are no roads. They have to build the roads. They have to chop trees down. So the whole time they're in battle, they're also building roads. That's one of the reasons the Army is still, to this day, about engineering. It's what the Army does, right? It's meant to do that. It's got to build this stuff so others can move in. And that is exactly what America is like. The woods of the East Coast, and I still find this astounding, even though I've been teaching it for 30 years, the woods of the East Coast were so thick that you could smell pine almost 150 miles into the Atlantic Ocean. That's how thick it was. Right? Now, that's great, but it also means that when you're going to move into those lands, this is a lot of manpower. No chainsaws, no ditch witches, no caterpillars, right? Nothing like that. This is all manual labor, so it's going to take a while. So keep in mind that as of 1815, settlement is still roughly at the Appalachians, with a few exceptions like Daniel Boone going into Kentucky, but we're talking about 100 guys. We're not talking about much else. And so very famously, and I do want you guys all to know this is not just trivia at this point, but very famously, Thomas Jefferson gives a speech in 1801. And in that speech, President Jefferson says, it will take over 1,000 years for American settlement to reach St. Louis. 1,000 years. Says that in 1801. All right. Anyone in here want to challenge Thomas Jefferson's intelligence? I mean, if this were some buffoon, we could laugh at him. This may be the single smartest person ever born on American soil. He says it's going to take 1,000 years. The British laugh uproariously when they read this report from Thomas Jefferson. And they write in their own official parliamentary reports, Jefferson is so wrong in his exaggeration. It will not take more than 300 years to reach St. Louis. Right? Why are they so wrong? Anybody know when Missouri wants to come in as a state? Missouri is full all the way to Kansas City by 1819. Jefferson is off by 981 years. That's huge. Why did he make a guess like that? Think about everything we've talked about. Why would he do that? Yeah.
Was he making an estimate based on how long it took to spread to the Appalachians and then multiply the distance?
Yeah, absolutely. It took 200 years to go from here to here. So of course, you just add that space, 200, 200, 200. Oh, here we are. We made it, right? But he's so off. That's crazy. Now, just imagine this. And this to me is even more astounding. So American settlement is here by 1819. By 1848, 30 years later, this is all ours. We control all the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Pacific. We have ports in Seattle and Portland and LA and San Francisco and San Diego. I mean, can you imagine that? We have all of that. Just stunning to think about everything we control. So we go 200 years hardly getting anything, and then over the next 30 years, we get it all. Or excuse me, we get it all. So everything is happening very, very rapidly. And this is a reason that we as Americans tend to think of this as ours. We took it very, very quickly. I would actually argue too quickly in hindsight. I mean, it's done. It's inevitable. It's not what was, it's what is. But think about every time we moved west, what question did we have to ask? Every single time. We now lament the loss of the natives. That's in hindsight, we can say that. That's for certain, right? And we can't, that's a fact. Though most Indians die because of disease, not because of warfare. But regardless, they're going to be wiped out. But what other question do we have to ask every time we go west? Starting with Missouri. Yeah.
Is it gonna be a slave state?
Is it going to be a slave state or a free state? And we never have a good answer for that. And we have to keep asking it. And they keep bringing up this horrific issue every few years that nobody can solve, right? I mean, we could have solved, but we didn't. We just make it worse and worse and worse. So it is absolutely essential to understand that there is no westward expansion without the question of slavery, and there is no extension of slavery without the question of westward expansion. America is intimately tied to that question, and that question is intimately tied to America. Not to the point where I think we need to just punish ourselves mercilessly like some people advocate today, but it's a question, and it's a big question. Okay, so what happens to America? How can we move that quickly and take it over? Why? And why with just these 5 groups and not others? Isn't that interesting? We've conquered America by the time the next wave of immigration comes. Remember the next wave of immigration? 1846. We own all this by 1847, with the slight exception of Tucson. We don't own Tucson yet, but everything else we've got. So what is it about America? What do? There are 2 things you have to understand about our character here. Right or wrong, it's just the way it was. What 2 things do we do really, really well? How can you take over land like that? Nobody's ever been able to take over that much land that quickly and make it theirs. So think about it logically for a moment. If Great Britain had wanted, wouldn't they control the whole world? Were they shy about this? I mean, they tried to take over China. They tried to take over India. They tried to take over Africa. They tried to take over all of North America, Australia, New Zealand. They did kind of succeed in some places, right? China still looks Chinese. India still looks Asian Indian. But North Dakota doesn't look like Sitting Bull's realm anymore. So why did the natives here fail, but the natives elsewhere succeeded? Yeah,
There are a lot
David.
fewer of them. I think, in China,
Yeah. Okay, so there are a lot fewer, right? We're talking about massive populations. There's still the native peoples, right? I mean, it's the story of the British trying to conquer the Chinese. It's not that different from trying to conquer the American Indians, is it?
They had maybe less developed civilization too.
Okay, yep, no doubt about that. American Indians were in a far more barbaric state. Barbarian meaning just primitive, not negative here. Yeah.
Yeah, they were perhaps less unified than Native Americans?
Yeah, absolutely. The Indians, of course, could rally around Hindu culture, and the Chinese around Buddhist and Confucian culture. Yeah, absolutely. So religion's going to play a huge role as opposed to kind of a primitive animism. Yeah, that's a great factor. Important factor. Not great, isn't good, but important. Okay, what else? Let's talk about the positives for a moment. We already have confirmed Americans are Protestant. They know how to form community, and they know how to read and write. So we have a lot of good records. What else are they good at? How do you make the land yours? I mean, anybody can go plant a flag. I mean, we have a flag on the moon, but, it's not really ours. Maybe someday, but not now. Leo.
We established rule of law.
Okay, we've got this rule of law, right, which goes along with the Bible and the common law. So the Wild West was never actually not wild. It was very, very sanitary and very orderly in a kind of chaotic, fun way. But, you know, with a few gunfights here or there. But generally, yeah, the crime level in San Francisco was always lower than it was in New York City. So, yeah. Tell me
they
anything.
farmed- Oh, Vika.
Yeah, sorry.
They farmed wherever
Farmed?
they explored.
Okay, and why? Tell me about that for a moment. What does farming matter? Why does it matter?
I mean, part of it is when you have the families who settle, then they have to make their community, and that's kind of like the basis.
Yeah?
But also it kind of unmistakably claims the land because you're kind of touching
How
it.
so? Tell me about that.
I mean, you're like ripping up the land and planting your own, whatever, like, seeds you brought with you.
Yeah.
So,
You are literally terraforming. You are remaking the world, aren't you? When you farm. Now, why does that work so well in Indiana, but not in central India? Mary Kate.
There was just so much, quote, available land, like it was so,
Okay, so there's available land, right? At least from our perspective. I don't know if, say, the Sioux would agree with that. But no, you're absolutely right. There's available land. Yeah.
The land's also just like better quality, is the climate better?
How do you judge better quality?
I don't know, richer soil.
Let's put it this way. Wherever the English do well, they do well because the climate and soil are identical to the home soil. New Zealand, Australia, Iowa, South Africa, those are all places that are basically just like England in terms of climate, in terms of soil, rainfall, it's all the same. Wherever the English go and they can take their agriculture, you're done. It doesn't matter who you are. They will take you over. But if you go to a place like China or Central Africa or Brazil or any of these other places, India, you don't have a chance. British, that is, the British don't have a chance. They don't understand the soil. They don't understand the culture. They don't know how to deal with it. And part of the problem with the American Indians is they're sitting on land that the British know exactly how to deal with. And think about it even, and I don't, you guys know I'm not that PC or anything, but think about what do we call a climate? And you said this, and I loved it. What do we call a climate where we can grow European things? We call it temperate. Well, if you're from central India, what's temperate is something totally different than if you're from the middle of England, right? That's very, very relative. But the fact we call them temperate zones, what we mean is they're like England. That's what we mean. And so that's a fascinating thing. And I want you to realize that, and whatever problems we have as Americans, we know how to farm. We are so good at it. We know how to take the land and remake it in what we think is best. And we do that over and over again, but through great labor. So one of the things that's important, if you guys remember, just from a half hour ago, one of the most important things to remember, these people are Protestant. They think what they're doing is God's will, and therefore they record everything. We have more diaries and letters from Americans in the 1600s and 1700s than almost any other people in the world until the modern era where we can collect everything. But that's because these people, whether they were settling Indiana or going on the Oregon Trail, thought what they were doing was important. So we have great diaries. And one of my favorite, you don't need to know the name of this family, but a Dutch family settled in northern Indiana around 1815. Their name was Ten Broek. And in their diaries, and I'm not exaggerating, we can look in their diaries, and what do they say? For breakfast, we had steak. For lunch, we had steak. For dinner, we had steak. And then right before bed, we finished up the steak. Now, just think about that for a moment. If I were a middle-class farmer in England, how often would I serve meat at all to my family? Maybe once a month. And of course, what would I do with it? It's got to last. So you never just eat the steak. You put it in soup, or you make stew. You think about it, stew is the ultimate peasant food. And I love stew. But you think about what it is. It's like all the crud that didn't go elsewhere, you put into the pot together. That's what stew is, right? We take all the leftovers and we put it in something. It's peasant food, totally. You're not going to go to a nice restaurant and be served stew, right? Unless there's some trendy thing going on, but that's not normal, right? Stew is peasant food, just like potlucks, and these are not high quality foods by any means. It's church lady fare, right? It's what you do as a community. But that's what's going on here. And imagine if I can have meat not once a month watered down, but 4 times a day. Now, first of all, if I ate steak 4 times a day, what would I look like? Right? I would not be able to get through that door. But these people, think what they're doing. They're burning all of that off. Every calorie they're burning off. They are working like mad. So what they produce with the land is what they're consuming as well. Right? So there's a kind of a weird, interesting symbiosis. But there were people, and the Tin Brooks among them, there were people who, in this part of the country, would just put their hands in the soil and feel it. Because nothing like that existed in England anymore, where people had been farming the same land for 2,000 years. You can walk into northern Indiana, put your hand in the soil, and pull up 6 or 7 inches of the blackest loam you've ever seen. And it's just full of every nutrient imaginable, and anything grows. I mean, imagine you're already predisposed to believing that God wills you to be here because this is the new Eden, and then it actually kind of seems like Eden because it produces everything. So my point is, whenever we see, and I know people like Dr. Gamble have done incredible scholarship about how we've turned America into a religion, and I agree with Dr. Gamble, we've gone way too far in turning America into a religion. But when you look at stories like this, and you realize it was a Garden of Eden for many, many, many people, it's hard not to feel that kind of urge of patriotism towards this. This is great stuff. And they used it, and they used it well. So there's another thing we do. So I want to get back to Ms. Tone's question, and that is, why only these 5 groups? How can they settle like they do? How can they take over a continent in just this many years? What is it that Americans do really, really well? And the Schleiters are a perfect example of this. What do Americans do? David?
Have kids, have a lot of kids.
We procreate like nobody's business, right? We have more children than any other people ever has, or most likely ever will, right? Leo, what number? I know you're number 1 out of how many?
Yes, there are 9 total.
Yeah, 9, right? I had a young woman in the other class, Hannah Cote, who's the oldest daughter of 11, right? The Whalens have 11. We have 7, and that makes us total slackers in this town, right? People like the Marinos only have 4. I mean, they're really low class, you know. But okay, so it's a little odd here in Hillsdale. We've got this kind of mini baby boom going on in Hillsdale. But I want you to just think about this for a moment and take a guess. And we're on the low side. How many children do you think American families had on average out on the frontier? And we're a frontier country, right? But look at that frontier. We're nothing but frontier. It's what we are. Mary Kate?
11.
It's a very, 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 very good guess. The average woman on the frontier, now not in Boston, not in cities, there 4 or 5 was max, right? So kind of like what Hillsdale is now would have been normal in urban areas then. But Mary Kate's absolutely right. The average woman had 13 children. Now,
Didn't like a lot of the children also though die?
Let's talk about this. Yeah, this is a perfect question. So let's think about this for a moment. So these are live births. 13 live births on average per woman on the frontier. Now think about what that means. That means, and please forgive me, a little biology 101 here for a moment. And please don't, I'm a guy saying this. So I don't want someone coming back to me in this room 20 years from now saying, Dr. Berzer, I followed your advice. It didn't work the way you said. So just keep it in mind. Okay. So here's what happens. The average girl, does not go through puberty in this time period up until the 20th century. It usually starts around 16 or 17. So that's much later than it is now. right? Obviously. Things have changed dramatically in the last 100 years. But the average woman goes through menopause during this time period at about age 40, 41. So that means a woman is capable of having children from about age 16 to 41 or 42. It's a lot different than now, which is more like 10 up through 50, right? So a lot different. And I'm going to get to your question, right? How does this work? So now think about that. What does that mean? And here's where you got to be careful about the advice I'll give you, because this is true for most women. It is not true for all women. So generally what happens is you get married, 9 months later you have your first child. It's very typical. And by the way, they all knew birth control. Don't ever think they didn't know what birth control was. They knew exactly what birth control was, and they rejected it. That was not part of the American ethos at all. Now, they didn't have modern birth control, obviously, but they had birth control methods that they rejected. They were really verboten in America, and always had been. So they knew how to do that, but they didn't. So let's say you're 16, you get married, 9 months later you have your first child, and you breastfeed. Right? It's norm. And this is where it gets a little odd. For most women, but not all, most women can breastfeed for 9 months without getting pregnant again. The body takes so much to produce the milk that it's not capable of also getting pregnant. But at that 9-month mark, you can get pregnant at any moment at that point, right? Obviously not any moments. So anyway, you guys know what, sorry, here's the guy speaking, right? Sorry. So it is quite possible. What that means then is that the average woman on the frontier had a baby every 18 months. That was her life. That was the norm. Now, what about these infant mortalities? This is a really interesting question. We're going to have a class. I'll give you warning when we do it, but we're going to have a whole class in the spring where we meet in the cemetery and we just walk around for that hour, for the 15 minutes. You'll see why. It makes sense, but we'll have class over there. And I want to show you some things, some pretty amazing things, actually, in all kinds of ways. But you'll find horror stories, really neat monuments where you have mom and dad who just moved to Hillsdale, and then their 6 kids all die. Right? Disease hits. And this infant mortality is outrageous in the 19th century. And yet, compared to what it had been all prior to history, we have the lowest infant mortality rate in the world during this time period. Why? Well, what's the difference? Why is it? And so here's where you have to understand. The English are having just as much procreative activities as Americans, but they're obviously not having the kids. Why? What's the difference between here and there? Yeah.
I mean, in England, everyone is kind of packed very close together, and there's a lot of like rats and garbage and just gross stuff everywhere. But in America, it's more spread out.
Yeah, what are these people having 4 times a day? Protein, steak, nutrition, right? So the nutrition rate changes everything with mortality, and especially infant mortality. Not that it's not still outrageously high compared to today, but it's nothing compared to what it had been. And that's the big difference. How much taller do you think? Let's just take an American in 1750. How much taller was an American than his British counterpart? It's all nutrition. And by the way, this is now completely around America, where it doesn't matter if you're of Vietnamese origin or if you're of English origin, Americans are also still much taller, except for Scandinavians and some Africans. We're still much taller than most peoples.
5 inches?
6. Yeah, great guess, Mary. Okay, very good guess. So the average person was 6 inches taller than the Brits. What do you think the American Revolution looked like? It's like the Kaltoffs versus the Berzers, right? I mean, it's like the giants versus the short people. So, and you think about someone like George Washington, who was 6'2" and ramrod straight. This guy looked like Goliath to the English, right? It's huge. He was huge by our standards then, but absolutely huge by those standards. So here's the rule on child infant mortality. Basically, infant mortality works this way, and it always has. When a woman conceives, there's a 50-50 chance the child will be born. When the child's born, there's a 50-50 chance it will reach age 2. By the time it reaches age 2, there's a 50-50 chance it'll reach age 15, and then another 50-50 chance it'll reach 30. But once a person reaches 30, this has always been true, it's pretty taken for granted that we'll live anywhere between about 70 and 90 years. In some places in China, in certain provinces of China, it's up to about 115. Same, strangely enough, Romania and Bulgaria have the highest age rates in the Western world. They're around 110. People think it's because of yogurt, but I honestly don't know. I mean, it's really interesting. That's where yogurt's from. So people have diets of that all their life. There may be something to that. But anyway, there are exceptions, obviously exceptions. But I just want you to keep that in mind. So I hope this wasn't too dry. I just want you guys to see that what we take for granted as Americans should never be taken for granted. This was hard work. And yes, we screwed up. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, slavery, the way we treated the Indians, we really, really, really screwed up. And we should be concerned with that. We need to learn from that. But there are also things we did that worked really, really well. And being families, we're great at. Having kids, we're great at. Reading books, we're great at. Those things you can't take away. So again, that's how we take over a continent. Not by immigration, though I'm all in favor of immigration, but not by immigration, but by just simple native families, meaning European families having lots and lots of kids. And here's an interesting thing too. Last thing I'll say. African Americans, even enslaved ones, had the same height and nutrition rate and infant mortality as did whites. So nutrition clearly plays a role in all of this because there's no freedom there, but they have the same rates. And that's very interesting as well. Okay, any final questions or comments? All right, thanks guys. This was fun for me. So hopefully it wasn't too dry. I will email you all this map, not that you really need it, but just keep that in mind. It'd be kind of fun, maybe on the midterm to have a map and have you guys talk about it. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. So have a great Monday and Tuesday.